So today's session is about, so you want to join a startup. We're dealing with early stage startups with the experts in this, Jessica Murray, who is the daughter of my first cousin, and Marci Weisler, who is an expert in multiple startup person. And she and I have known one another for years. That's Jess and I have. So Jess, quickly an intro, then Marci, and then I'll do the last 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me, Anna. Jessica Murray here. I'm the founder and owner of a business called Empower. And as the name suggests, I work with emerging startup founders and small business owners to empower them to take their business to the next level. And we do this by focusing on opportunities to particularly streamline operations, improve efficiency in systems and processes, and overall really try to shorten the distance between where that business is today and where they're trying to go.
Super. So nice to have you. Marci, over to you.
Thanks, Anna, and very happy I was able to do this today. So I've spent my career commercializing emerging technologies through startups of various sizes, from ground floor and starting something up to mid-sized companies and Fortune 500, Fortune 50 companies running emerging products. My experience has been by commercial, it's leading a team that is driving the growth, business development and partnerships, and kind of GMing different product lines.
Terrific. And as everyone knows, I'm Anna Murray, and I started as a startup in the late 90s. I started an early stage web firm, and I am still in effect running that firm. We developed many brands' first websites, and then we transformed into a generalized technology consulting company. So I like to refer to myself as a mini Accenture. We do large technology rollouts, technology consulting. We often come in, to keep on the startup theme, we come in sometimes when things are not so good and kind of work alongside a Jessica or a Marci to put a company, in many cases it has been startups, back on track to achieve success.
Oh, just to back up a little bit to share a bit more about my background at early stage companies. So prior to Empower, I've worked for over a decade in the technology ecosystem, working at everything from a seed stage startup all the way to global publicly traded companies. So I've seen my fair share of working in early stage teams, being employee number 20, and seeing companies grow through different stages. And I think some of the pros of working at a startup, and I can also speak to personal experience, there are a couple. So I really joined an early stage startup because I was working on Wall Street previously, and I really wanted to learn how businesses were built from the ground up and accelerate my learning curve. And I really did get that very quickly once I joined a company. And I think one of the pros of joining an early stage company is the amount of exposure you can get early on really quickly and not just be sort of isolated to your functional area. Now, on the flip side, sometimes for people that can also be a challenge or a con, in that if you come from a larger company, you're often very used to having your lane or your specific role, and having to kind of adapt and wear a lot of different hats might not be well suited for you. But I think what's important is really understanding what you're going in and trying to accomplish by joining a startup. And if something you're looking for is accelerated career growth, more broad-based exposure, and also being part of almost a movement, I think that's another reason that people join startups, is they really feel the mission and like they can be part of transforming an industry. Then it could be something that's a really good opportunity for you.
That's great. I think that is a lot of people's dream, right? To like really impact a business, to not be sort of in your lane or in your silo, but to be able to, excuse me, as you say, wear many hats. I always joke, like when you're in a small company and you're standing in front of the coffee machine, and you go, whose job is it to fix the coffee machine? And the answer is, if you're standing in front of it, that's you. And that could be in a startup, marketing or technology. So, Marci, what do you think? We let Jessica do the pros. What are some of the cons of joining? Maybe you want to weigh in on the pros too.
Well, I think, following up on Jessica's point, there are many reasons to do it. And I think some of it um, depends where you're at also in your career and your priorities. But one thing I will say first regarding the reasons, since we were on that thread, I believe one reason not to do it is if your motivation is, I'm going to be the next unicorn. And I have worked with companies that where the founders have gone in and then hired people on that promise. And, we we read a lot, see a lot about the successes. Um, and many companies are successful in their own right without getting there, but that can't be the primary driving factor. You are solving a problem, you are offering a product that is valuable to whoever your audience is. You've got to believe in both one, the people more than anything, because businesses pivot, and two, you've got to believe in what they're offering when you're joining and that they have the chops to grow a business that may not look like what it started as a year later, 6 months later, 6 years later. Things evolve. And as we all know, the market moves very quickly these days, much more rapidly. There's exponential speed compared to what it used to be. So one, that's really important. So to go on to the con side, because I think Jessica noted a lot of the good reasons to do it. And it is also, you're lacking the bureaucracy. You are able to feel a real sense of accomplishment pretty quickly. Um, but the cons are that one, there isn't much structure if you're joining very early, and maybe you're being brought in to add that structure or experience or maturity. But maybe if you're early in your career, you might just be, if a startup is your first experience, you might not know otherwise. And listen, I've had the privilege of working at a lot of different companies and fell into startups because I liked what I call bright, shiny things, and like met people who were running companies that were creating products, many of which are defunct and like were very either ahead of the market, which is another challenge, and just didn't meet it at the right place, some of which were super successful. And everything in between. But the cons are there's not much structure. You really need to be able to both live in uncertainty, and you need to have the agility that your job might change, the company might change. But on that positive side, you get to do and learn all these different things. So
Hey, Jess, what do you think when someone who's maybe from a huge organization or a mid-sized organization joins a startup? What do you think is surprising to them when that happens? What can catch them off guard?
I think there are a number of things, and Marci touched on some of them, one of which is, especially early stage, there might not be a ton of structure. So if you're coming from a large organization, and even some large organizations don't have the best structure. So we say large organization being structured, but we all know every company has its own dysfunction here and there. But that lack of structure can be jarring for people. I also think something that could be surprising, especially if you're coming in at sort of a mid-senior level or even a senior level at a startup, but at your large organization, you are still several layers removed from the CEO or the visionary behind the company. I think one thing that can catch people off guard is being so directly in communication or in line to a visionary CEO. And that's just very different. And, it can be great exposure and experience, but I do think people have to really get used to communicating and working with visionaries and figuring out how to influence someone who has really strong conviction around what they're trying to build and how they're trying to build it. And I think the other thing, although this shouldn't be surprising when they come in because they've already sort of negotiated their package, but compensation is very different at early stage companies, especially when you're kind of pre-seed, seed, series A. You're going to have below what you believe is market compensation packages from a cash in your hand standpoint. And some of your compensation is really going to be tied to equity and success of the company. And while I think people coming in, myself included, can kind of mentally wrap our heads around that before we join, when that starts to become, 3-4 years down the line, and, you still haven't gotten to that point of scale where you can be paid at market levels, I think that can kind of be surprising. So I think people really have to come in with open eyes about that as well.
Hey, Marci, when people, I know we've all been in the tech space for a while, so we've seen people move in and out of startups. So talk to me a little bit about what that looks like why people move in, and then maybe why and move out. And
Hey, I myself have moved in and out, and it's for all the things we've talked about and will continue to talk about. And I think, listen, to Jess's point, at different points in your life, you may have different priorities, and you need, whether those are driven by near-term cash compensation versus a longer term, if you have flexibility in the short term, but those need to be a consideration. But also for myself, learning to operate at different levels and understanding what principles from big companies you can bring to small, and what companies from small, scrappy, you can bring to big, but learning they're not the same. They are very much not the same. And entrepreneurship or inside innovation within a big company is different than entrepreneurship. So I think, and I was just talking to someone at a big consulting firm this week who was telling me about someone who was on her team who left to join a startup, came back 2 years later, left again for another startup, came back because that person realized she was more suited to having structure around her and/or wanted the structure of compensation, benefits, things like that. I think, listen, equity is exciting. And as I said, not everything will be a unicorn. It doesn't mean you're not going to win from it, but it is long-term incentive. And I think understanding that, companies go through many rounds of funding, which affects everybody's equity potentially. And you got to get smart. And, there are plenty of ways to learn about this, but what does it really mean for you? And I think, for myself, it's about understanding, where do you stand? What do you see the long-term opportunity? And you must be comfortable with where you are at and what you are getting when you join, and then how that scales, and reevaluate it, say, every year. People change, and sometimes, if the company's doing really well, you can win really big, but you cannot count on that.
This wasn't one of the questions that we talked about in our prep, but I'm curious your perceptions of this. If you're moving, let's say you spend some time in a startup, do you see that as a net benefit for your other career as you're in the job market, saying,
You mean, is it attractive to big companies that you've been in a startup?
Yeah.
I think it is, depending where you have been and what you have done. I think there are some things you need to consider. One, as you go from smaller to larger, even if you were a C-level in this smaller, you might end up being a manager, senior manager at a Fortune 50 company. You might have a ton of responsibility with that title, but if there are thousands or tens of thousands of employees, it's a very different structure. So you need to understand what you want out of that. I think companies really do, big companies, they value the agility that someone brings coming from a startup. But you also are going to need to convince a hiring manager that you can work within the constraints of a big organization. So, like for me, one of the things, well, I had spent a good chunk of my career before going to a Fortune 50 company at smaller startups, growth companies, mid-sized companies. I was doing business development, commercialization. I was working with large organizations. So I understood, at least from the outside, how they worked. And I understood that, going and talking to a big CPG or telecom as a scrappy startup, like if you can accomplish that, that's pretty good. But like seeing it from the inside, you understand why it moves so slow. And you've got to go in with the expectation of the pace is going to be slower. It doesn't mean you're going to be less busy, but it's just different. So I think I think especially too, if you come in, if a big company is looking for subject matter expertise on something that is an emerging technology, grabbing someone who has been at a startup and done just that is often very beneficial. So
that's really useful, I think, for people thinking about how this is going to impact their careers, what they're going to do. Now, our title is So You Think You Want to Join a Startup. So Jess, if we're talking about joining a startup, there's the excitement, right? There's the vision, there's the potential to make money. I think we've sort of given a cautionary note, like that can't be your only motivation. You can't expect to be in the next unicorn. But coming from the outside, what are some of the factors that you think need to be in place for a startup to have a chance at success? Knowing that success is largely that luck is a component, market is a component, all these things. But are there things that, all of that aside, really should be in place to sort of like be in the game, to have a chance of having an exit, making the money, and then the red flags about like, that shouldn't be there.
Yeah, I think first and foremost for a startup to be in the game, you really have to know that you are solving a real challenge for a real customer. Do you have something that the market really needs, and are you approaching it differently? Is there at least initial sense of product market fit? Is the pain acute enough for the customer that you will be able to sell this in market and be able to show traction so that you can raise money, et cetera? So I think like at the very heart of it is, are you solving a real problem for the market? And then I also think you have to have a strong early team. Like people, we're still in the people business here. And I think the early people on the team are really going to be able to make or break whether that good idea or that challenge you're solving can get to market, build traction, grow the company, et cetera. So I'd say, without going through the exhaustive list of all the things that probably need to be in place, I think those two things are really important. And then when it comes to sort of red flags, I think doing your due diligence around building your own perspective on what the company is doing and whether they are actually solving a real challenge in the market, and sort of making that sort of decision on your own. If you don't see it there and you don't start talking to people who are in that space, so, for example, if you're a business that is building technology to help people virtually try on clothes so that, when they get their online order, it actually comes and it's the right size. Well, if you talk to people who are shopping online and they're like, oh, that's not a really big problem for me, et cetera, like that's going to be a red flag. So I think when you are joining a startup, especially early stage, you kind of have to do your own due diligence, like you're an investor, to say, is this company actually doing something that can be a business? And is it a big enough opportunity? And then I think, again, sort of, red flags around people or your interactions with the early team, and those sorts of things. But I do think kind of, are we solving a real problem here is kind of core, in my opinion.
Marci, I'll turn that question around on you, get it a little bit narrower and say, what do you like to see in founders specifically?
So they come in many shapes and sizes.
Many flavors of founders. Yeah.
Listen, I think the people are really important. And I think there's a question of both once you've qualified the idea, and sometimes you actually come in with that being secondary and working with people that you've known and have a relationship with, and are those founders who you think they are? I think it's understanding, what experience and role does that founder come with? What if it's a business side founder versus a tech or product founder, that is very different. And is that person surrounding him or herself with the right people? For me, it's really important, especially, listen, coming in at least at a leadership role, is this person willing to listen to feedback and to consider it? Founders, at least at the early stage, they maintain a lot of control over decision making, and you've got to expect that. But at least for me, I'd like someone who is willing to engage and consider alternatives or recommendations, especially if they haven't lived the game before. I mean, founders who have done it before, really good. And keep in mind, there are some people who are great early stage founders, and they should only be with the company until the company hits a certain scale. And even if someone has a track record, has left or placed as, say, the CEO at a certain point, that's not the negative against that person, depending where and why. Like, I know a couple people who are serial founders, and they're kind of all over the place. They're brilliant. They can be difficult, but maybe they listen. But at a certain size and scale, they need more, I'd say, disciplined and more specialists to surround themselves with, and they may maintain the vision of the company. And listen, you have those, classic stories of people who have maintained, like, you've got the Steve Jobs came back, but then you've got people like, let's take really, accomplished female founder, Sarah Blakely, who founded Spanx, who built that, going door to door, and really was the CEO for many, many years through growth. And I know she's just started another business, but that was after running it for years. So you have to, I think, listen, to me, joining a startup, you probably should come with a high EQ.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And you should hope that a founder also has that, but that's not always the case, and that doesn't make them a bad founder or a bad decision. You just have to know what you're entering.
That's really wise advice, Marci. And I know my job here is to moderate, but I have some passion around this topic, so I'll weigh in as if I've turned the question back around on me. I've come in to rescue at least half a dozen startups that have gone sideways, a couple times with success, a couple times without success. I think at the early stage, I see a startup as kind of a canoe, right? It's a very shallow boat. It's not a big tanker with a lot of inertia and mass. And so it's super important that the founder or the founder group kind of keep their eyes on the ball, their eyes on the horizon, because many things can really tilt that boat rather drastically. Someone can come in with some negative feedback that tilts it this way, and someone can come in with some positive feedback that tilts it the other way. So I think that the founder group has to be founder group has to be very sensible and pragmatic and listen for sure, that EQ part. But also, I think that there's some filtering out that has to happen, because if you listen too much at that early stage, it's like that mess of an artwork or that mess of a novel where everybody's, putting their 2 cents in. So that would be point number one, that I think the founder or founders really need to be able to keep that very small canoe steady until it gets a little bit more mass. And the second thing I would say has to do with the idea. I think that I see in a lot of, and interesting that you brought up Spanx, Marci, because I think that what I'm talking about right now is maybe more tech centric than physical product. People are that unicorn thing. People are always looking for that big idea. And the thing of it is, by the time that the idea hits the media, we could say Bitcoin, AI, these kind of buzzy words, you might be a little bit past the curve, right? That the truly valuable opportunities may be in things that you haven't heard about. So if you're thinking of joining a company, I think one of the things that can distract either a new employee or an investor or a new supporter, an advisor, is these days, does it have anything to do with AI? Well, honestly, maybe it shouldn't. Maybe the idea that has nothing to do with AI is the one that, are the set of ones to be considering, because there's this glom on factor that happens both from employees and in founders. So those would be my thoughts on that one. Let's talk about the current environment. There's a lot of, I think as both of you friends know, I tend to tune out. That I have like a proclivity to tune out the environment because I think it can be a distraction, but it is real. We do operate in a context in the real world. So Jess, how would you characterize the current environment in terms of startups? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a very different environment than people were seeing 3 years ago. I think there are a lot of factors behind that. Some of it's higher cost of capital, and things like that. And depending on the industry you're in, there are just things that have happened in the economy that have shifted kind of the hyper growth, grow at all cost, money's abound environment that we were in sort of 3 years ago. So I do think capital is a bit tighter, which means that companies are having to be a lot more fiscally responsible with their resources, stretch resources out, be more creative in funding rounds. And also it can be a lot harder to get funded when you're pre-revenue or pre-product. And I just think the rules of the game have shifted a little bit. That being said, there's still a lot of interesting innovation in companies that are getting funding and growing. And from founders I've talked to recently, it does feel like the market's opening up a bit more than as compared to 6 to 9 months ago, where I think there were a lot of verticals, one that is near and dear to my heart because I've worked at several startups, but prop tech, for instance, has had a lot of struggle. And part of that's because
prop tech. What is prop tech?
Real estate technology.
Property.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So, both because of the rising interest rates and other things just going on in the housing and commercial real estate market, like that's been a really tough market the past 18 months. But I think for companies that have been weathering the storm and have been able to show more profitable business models, and show that path to profitability, they are seeing more interest than they might have 6 months ago. So I do think it's a different environment. And then, in terms of just flavors of the year, and you touched on it, like AI is something everybody's talking about and seems to be the topic du jour. But that's not, again, that's what we hear about in the media, but those aren't the only segments that are seeing interest this year. Fintech is always one that sees a lot of attention in different aspects of the financial services ecosystem. I think, Anna, this probably more than all of us, but there's a lot of attention on cybersecurity, and companies that are innovating in that space as well, climate tech, biotech. So I think there's been some shifts in sort of where the attention is. We hear a lot about AI, but some of those sectors are getting a lot of funding and interesting companies that are coming coming up in the
Follow up to
ecosystem.
you, Jess, on that. Do you think that I know I've heard also that the environment in the last, X number of years, months has been more difficult. Do you think there's been a healthy side of that? That is there
Yeah,
sort of
I definitely think there's been a healthy side of it. You know, companies have to figure out how to build a sustainable business model. Like, we can't have companies that are continuously burning and burning and burning cash. Like, yes, you have to lose money to make money in this sort of startup environment, but I think we were sort of seeing artificially high valuations and valuations that couldn't necessarily be supported. And I think it did feel really frothy there, at the end of 2022 or end of 2021, or 2021 going into 2022. So I do think there is a healthy component to all of this. And I do think you are seeing more emphasis on, okay, great, you have a great idea. So let's not just build that great idea, but let's build a real business that we can see a path to success and profitability. And so, yeah, that has made the environment a little bit more difficult, but probably in a good way. Growth at all costs, or at all and any cost, isn't necessarily a healthy environment to be in either.
so thanks for that. That's such great insights from people who have a broad horizontal look at things, talking to different founders. Marci, what are you seeing in the environment right now? How would you characterize it?
I think it's a little weird in terms of inconsistency.
Yeah.
And I think in addition to what Jess said, listen, you have a bunch of companies that were funded during and just post-COVID because there was a lot of capital that needed to be deployed. But if you're funded at a level that's really high and you don't make your numbers, like there's long-term issues and ramifications for that too. So what I'm seeing is, the VC world is constantly shifting too, and where there used to be more not easy access, but clarity on who is investing, very pre-seed friends and family. Now, most formalized funds want to see companies once they're at a state where they have revenue that is sustainable. So I think there are a few things. Like, one, it also benefits you as a founder, early stage employee, to stay away from, that kind of capital, institutionalized capital, longer. You probably can hold on to more, but it means you're doing things leaner. On the flip side, there are all these tools you can use that never used to exist. So you can actually build a company more scrappily and cost effectively early on. And you can build companies that don't need the infrastructure. So I think, everything is changing constantly. I do think right now, listen, we're less than a month away from the election, so vote. And a lot of people, and this isn't just in terms of startups, there are a lot of people waiting to see what happens before they deploy their money, whether that's funding a startup. I've also, I live in and around the media, advertising, marketing world, and a lot of the stuff I do, there are ad budgets that are on hold until people know what's happening, which is usually not the case in Q4 as we approach Christmas. So I think people are being thoughtful with the flavor of the year, flavor of the month, as we're talking about. Listen, AI is here. It doesn't mean it's not here. And there have been some trends, whether it's NFTs or something like that recently, that really have kind of come and gone. But there are components of even that, blockchain. There are other uses for blockchain that aren't as sexy as consumer focused, where companies are deploying the technology. So AI for AI's sake, there are those big players, but you're going to see a lot of both investment, interesting startups solving problems, but also fallout, because it is this deluge. So I do think from what I've seen in the market and people I've talked to on the funding side, on the founding side, and even on the M&A side, people are expecting more activity in 25 than there has been, but things are still tight. And that's a combination of where the world's at, interest rates coming down, and people looking to deploy capital that they need to deploy.
Okay, team, we are, thanks, Marci. We're coming around the clubhouse turn here. It may be that we did not go live and we have this on recording. So I want to save a teeny bit at the end to do our, I don't know, we call it an intro, maybe a post-tro of our sessions, and we're to keep it to our time frame. So right before we do that, let's do a lightning round. All right, here's the lightning round. First, war story. 30 seconds or less. No names, don't name names, especially if the name is me. A war story that you encountered at a startup. Jess, go.
I mean, I've worked at companies that had weeks of capital left, and that can be a very challenging, scary, stressful environment. So I'd say I have war stories from that I can't necessarily share, but being at a company when you've got that little bit of runway and figuring out how you get over to the other side, I'd say you're part of a wartime startup environment.
Yeah, and an amazing experience too if you make it, right? Yeah.
Right.
Marci, war story.
Well, I'll give you two very fast ones. Sometimes things change and you don't have the capital you think you have. And I actually was at a startup that had overspent due to push and prodding by the board on marketing, a lot of investment, and the market changed on some fronts, and we had to lay off part of our staff. So laying off people is really one of the least pleasant things. And I had to call in from my honeymoon too, because I didn't want my team to be laid off by people other than me. So that is one war story.
War story, man.
And I'm going to give you one other example too, just because I think it's important for people to hear. Like, sometimes it's not about the company. Someone who I had worked closely with who went on to start another company that was really interesting was dependent on a data set from some of the big tech players, and that their major partner decided they were no longer going to share that data set and changed the rules of engagement. And that was the end of that business. So like there are little war stories about what happens when you're on Zoom or passing someone in the hall, but there are also big market factors that can play in and create those stories.
Yeah. My war story is working on correcting a startup tech platform. And the founder was one of these visionary, but very, let's say, big personality founders who was so upset at having gone through tech problems, which are normal. I wouldn't say these were, beyond the scale normal or minor. They were sort of somewhere in the middle, and literally pulled the plug a month before launch in a temper tantrum. So that is a bite your off your nose, cut off your nose to spite your face. Okay, so next quick lightning round, which is dream startup you would like to join. If you or your friend would like, or Jeff you'd like to consult for, Marci you'd like to found, me I'd like to jump in and help with their tech platform. Give me two qualities of that dream startup. You would just like, I'm in. Jess.
Oh man, I gotta go first with all these. That's a hard one.
Oh, that is hard. Okay.
I'll go first.
Marci can
I'll
go
go
first.
first. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, I think for me, the dream startup is founding something that has market resonance with the team I want to work with. And I have done this, and for me, it is very much about the people who I know I want to spend a lot of time with, where we communicate well and are complementary not complementary, but our skill sets, what we bring to the table. 1 + 1 + 1 equals, 4, 5, or 6, and are aligned on, kind of the vision and what we want to create, and know how to bring the right pieces together to do it. So that's, for me, it's about a framework like that.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
And I
I'll
think
go second.
a little
Go ahead.
bit, I'll go now,
All
but
right,
a
all right,
little
you
bit
go.
similar, but also different. I think I've always sort of envisioned the perfect startup for me to join. It's about the people, but also I've always seen myself as the person who can work with the visionary to translate the vision into execution. And I think really finding that partner in a CEO or a visionary that I feel like, to Marci's point, you can go through battles with, you can want to spend a lot of time with, you really sort of believe that they've got the right strategy, product, vision to build a successful business, and that we can bring the right team around us to help bring it to reality. And then I think more and more, just from personal interest perspective, some of the areas of focus that I find to be both interesting, but I also think just existentially important in some ways, are around what can we do to build a better environment. So things around climate or sustainability or building better products for us is really interesting. Or back to sort of the real estate point, but taking a slightly different lens, like urban infrastructure and designing cities for the future, I think is like a really interesting space. So I think if I could find that right balance between sort of the areas or segments of the market that I can find myself getting attached to for a long time, and the people, that would be sort of an ideal situation.
So it's wonderful when we have, resonance here. I'll echo what everyone says about the people. I think you have to have, the strong CEO, founder, visionary, strong, visionary, sensible, smart, all of those things together. And then I guess what I would add for just folks to keep their eyes open for is that, for me, I think you gals have heard me say it before, that about once a decade, for me, something comes across my viewfinder that I think is truly transformational. So for me, the idea would be, a really great founder group with one of those ideas. Again, we don't guarantee success in this business. None of this discussion guarantees success, but that would be the ideal conference. Thanks so much for a terrific panel today. It was a great conversation. I learned a lot from you guys, and we'll look forward to having future conversations on other startup topics.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.